Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a really complex and layered topic today.
Yeah, definitely complex. We've got news reports, policy analysis, even some deeply personal accounts here.
And our mission with this deep dive is to understand some, well, pretty significant recent developments in U.S. immigration policy.
Right. We're looking specifically at the use of this super old law, centuries old actually, for modern deportations.
And also this massive proposed bill, right? The
Yeah.
one covering immigration, but also like a whole lot of other areas.
Exactly. So we'll explore the legal stuff, the political debate, which is pretty heated.
The funding, too. Those numbers are, well, there's something else when you dig in.
They really are. And crucially, the human impact. We want to pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, straight from the material you've shared.
Okay, so let's start with that old law. It sounds like something out of a history book, but it's actually making headlines now. The Alien Enemies Act.
It really is a blast from the past. Dates all the way back to 1798.
1798. Wow. That's over 225 years old. What does it let the president do?
Well, basically, it gives the president powers to detain and deport foreign nationals, but only from an enemy country.
An enemy country?
Yeah, and only during a declared war, invasion, or what the law calls a threatened predatory incursion.
Okay, and the original context back then, 1798, was the U.S. thinking it was going to war with France.
That's right. That specific situation prompted it. And historically, its use has been incredibly rare.
How rare?
Before this recent stuff, the sources say it was only formally used 3 times. War of 1812, World War I, and World War II.
WWII is probably the one most people might have heard of in relation to this.
Yeah, that was the last time it was used on a significant scale.
And that involved?
Well, the sources detail it was the legal basis for things like the internment of, I think, around 120,000 people of Japanese descent.
Right, and also German and Italian folks, too, wasn't it? Often without trial.
Exactly, without trial during that conflict.
So, okay. An 18th century wartime power used maybe 3 times before now, most notably for internment without trial in WWII. And the material says it's being used now. How?
That's the really surprising part. The Trump administration has recently used this act as the legal basis for deporting alleged gang members.
Alleged gang members, not soldiers from an enemy nation.
Correct. And the sources give specifics like a March 2025 deportation. 261 alleged Venezuelan gang members sent to El Salvador.
Okay, and how many of those were removed specifically using this 1798 law, according to the White House?
The White House said 137 of them were removed under the Alien Enemies Act.
137. So how did they justify using a wartime act meant for an enemy country against alleged gang members from Venezuela? What was the connection, according to the sources?
Oh, well, the administration's rationale, as the sources lay it out, actually uses the language from the 1798 Act itself.
Really?
Yeah. A proclamation on March 15th claimed these migrants were members of the Tren de Aragua gang conducting irregular warfare.
Irregular warfare.
Or threatening an invasion against the U.S. They explicitly use those terms from the act.
Wow. So the key thing here is redefining alleged gang activity as irregular warfare or invasion to fit this old wartime law into a peacetime context.
That seems to be the crux of the legal argument they put forward.
I imagine that redefinition would spark some serious opposition.
Oh, absolutely. It immediately drew sharp criticism, legal challenges from all sorts of groups.
What were the main arguments from critics, like the ACLU, Brennan Center, civil rights groups mentioned in the sources?
Well, their core points, based on the material, are that using the act now is illegal because, the U.S. isn't actually in a declared state of war, which the act specifies.
Okay, that makes sense.
They also argue it's discriminatory based on nationality or ancestry, and that it's just a massive overreach of executive power.
And Venezuela itself objected.
Yes, the Venezuelan government criticized it, saying it unjustly criminalizes Venezuelan migration and evokes, quote, darkest episodes in the history of humanity. Pretty strong language.
Definitely. And this fight played out in the courts, right? The sources describe a real back and forth.
A lot of back and forth, yeah. Initially, lower courts in New York, Colorado, and Texas actually ruled against the administration using the act for Venezuelans.
But then the Supreme Court got involved in April. What did they say?
Right, April 7th. The Supreme Court said the administration could use the act for alleged gang members. But, and this is key, they added a condition.
Which was?
Deportees have to be given a chance to challenge their removal. So the court allowed the power, but kind of slapped on a due process requirement.
Got it. So that condition, that due process part, that led to more court actions.
Exactly. Those later temporary blocking orders from lower courts.
Yep.
They happened specifically because, according to reports, deportees weren't being told their rights.
They weren't informed they could challenge it.
Or even the specific legal reason they were being removed under this act.
And the Supreme Court had to step in again on that specific point.
Yeah, April 19th. They paused deportations for a specific group in North Texas for that exact reason, lack of notice about the right to contest.
And since then, we've seen different federal judges rule differently, haven't we? It seems legally unsettled.
Very much so. On May 1st, you had federal judge Fernando Rodriguez. Yeah. His ruling was pretty significant.
Why?
Because according to the sources, it was the first time a federal judge flat out declared using the Alien Enemies Act for Venezuelan migrants unlawful.
Okay, so a direct rejection, but then another judge, Stephanie Haynes in Pennsylvania, ruled differently just a couple of weeks later.
Right, May 13th. Judge Haynes allowed using the act for accused gang members, but she also required 21 days notice, actually, and the opportunity to challenge. So different outcomes, but both reflecting that due process concern.
This whole legal fight also seemed to create some direct tension between the White House and the judges themselves, based on the source.
Yeah, definitely. The sources mentioned this conflict with federal judge James Boasberg. He apparently tried to halt some deportations, but the White House said his order had no lawful basis and that the removals had already happened anyway.
And the White House response was pretty public and critical.
Very. According to the reports, the administration hit back on social media, called the judge a grandstander, said he should be impeached. It really highlights how intense this clash became.
Wow, impeached. And adding another layer here, there was a mention in one source about a top aide saying they were considering suspending habeas corpus.
Yeah, actively looking at it was the phrase reported.
And habeas corpus is, remind us.
It's the fundamental right to have a judge review whether your detention is lawful. You can't just be held indefinitely without cause.
So the idea of suspending that in this context.
It speaks volumes, according to the analysis in the sources, about how far the administration was potentially willing to push executive authority over deportations.
Okay, so we have this really old law being used in a new way, sparking huge legal fights, questions about executive power. Now let's shift gears to Congress. This massive bill being proposed in the House.
Right, the legislative side. This is the package referred to in the material as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
One Big Beautiful Bill, quite a name.
It is, and it aims to reshape policy across, well, a ton of areas. Taxes, government spending, and of course, border security.
And the White House sees this as crucial.
The sources say the White House view is it's absolutely essential for the president to deliver his agenda. It did pass a key House committee, but just barely, which shows it still faces a tough fight.
Let's focus on the immigration and border parts. The funding levels described in the sources sound pretty significant.
They are definitely eye-opening. The bill reportedly includes $155 billion in new funding just for immigration enforcement.
$155 billion new. Whoa. What does that bring the total funding to for things like enforcement, the wall, detention, raids?
According to the sources, it brings the total funding for all that up to $185 billion.
Okay, $185 billion. And the key takeaway, the surprising insight from that number.
Well, the analyses cited in the sources point out that this proposed funding level is more than 5 times the current funding for these areas.
5 times?
Yeah. It represents a really massive proposed shift in spending priorities towards enforcement.
Okay, 5 times current levels. Where would some of that huge increase actually go?
Well, big chunk, $27 billion, is reportedly for ICE agents and operations.
$27 billion for ICE. What would that mean for the agency?
The sources state it would nearly triple ICE's current funding.
Triple it?
Yeah, potentially making it the single highest funded federal law enforcement agency. Critics mentioned in the material worry this enables, due process violations, harms workplace conditions, and leads to more aggressive enforcement, even against lawful residents or citizens.
Becoming the top-funded federal law enforcement agency, that's a major potential shift. What about detention? Is there money for that?
A lot. The bill reportedly has $35 billion, specifically for new and expanded immigrant detention centers, running through 2029.
$45 billion just for detention centers. How does that compare to, say, the regular prison system?
Well, analyses in the sources suggest this could nearly quadruple the annual detention budget. One analysis pointed out that ICE's annual budget for detention could end up being almost 50% larger than the entire federal prison system's budget.
Wait, the budget for civil immigration detention potentially 50% larger than the entire federal prison system budget.
That's the comparison made in one of the source analyses.
Yeah.
It really highlights the proposed scale of investment just in holding facilities for immigrants.
That's staggering. What about the border itself? Enforcement, construction.
There's $83.2 billion in new money proposed there. That includes a huge amount for border wall construction, $51.6 billion. The White House apparently has specific mileage goals for that.
$51.6 billion for the wall.
Plus more funding for agents, technology like $6.3 billion for surveillance and vetting tech, and $5 billion for the Department of Defense to support border ops. That could mean military deployments, temporary holding sites.
And is there money for states involved in border enforcement too?
Yes. An extra $12 billion was reportedly added to reimburse states for their costs. Sources suggest states like Texas, which have been doing a lot on their own, would likely benefit significantly.
Okay, huge funding increases. Does the bill include other sort of punitive measures related to immigration beyond just funding enforcement?
It does. One thing mentioned is a 3.5% fee on remittances sent by non-citizens.
Remittances, like
Yeah.
money immigrants send back home.
Exactly. And critics quoted in the sources worry this could effectively turn staff at money transfer places into immigration agents needing to check customer status.
What about fees for applying for things or going through immigration court?
The bill proposes pretty high fees there, too. Hundreds of dollars for applying for relief in court, maybe thousands if you're facing enforcement actions.
And changes to healthcare access?
Yeah, it reportedly ends taxpayer-funded Medicaid for people described in the bill as illegal immigrants. Sources estimate that could affect about 1.4 million people. And it also specifically prohibits Medicaid funds from being used for gender transition procedures for minors.
Okay, so hitting finances, access to courts, healthcare. And the sources emphasize this bill is way broader than just immigration, right?
Oh, yeah, it's massive. Briefly, the sources mention extending old tax cuts, ending taxes on tips, big boosts in defense spending, including this Golden Dome for America missile defense thing, plus spending cuts elsewhere, especially Medicaid.
It also creates those mega accounts for babies.
Right, a $1,000 federal deposit for newborns, and overhaul student loans, simplifying repayment, ending fraud forgiveness, and taxes university endowments. It really covers a lot of ground.
Given all that, especially the immigration enforcement surge, how is this whole package being debated? What are the concerns raised in the sources?
Well, critics argue it basically lays the groundwork for mass deportations on a scale we haven't seen. Some analyses warn it could spark unrest, really push the boundaries of executive power, maybe even distract from economic problems.
And we see signs of this tension in the real-world events mentioned, like those protests in L.A.
Exactly. Sources mention L.A. protests triggered by immigration raids, and then the whole controversy around the president sending military personnel there, even though the state objected.
Right. Governor Newsom called it an assault on democracy, challenged the legality.
And Representative Berrigan also raised concerns, noted in the sources, about the administration using words like insurrection and invasion, worrying it could set the stage for even more drastic actions later.
Okay, we've talked about repurposing an old law, the court battles, this huge funding bill. But what does all this mean for actual people, for families? Let's shift to the human toll, using those personal accounts from the sources.
Yeah, it's crucial. Looking beyond the policy debates, the funding numbers. The stories in sources like the Human Rights Watch report really show the impact. These are just a few examples from the material, but they illustrate what deportation actually means.
Let's start with Diego R. His story's not like being ripped away from your whole life.
Diego was deported at 24. He lived in the U.S. since he was 3. He had a U.S. citizen wife, young kids here.
Deported at 24 after being here since age 3. What triggered it?
A minor offense, really. A DWI plea after an alleged failed sobriety test, and they found some marijuana. A later blood test reportedly showed no alcohol or drugs. The source highlights the huge financial strain on his family, his wife trying to keep him connected to the kids, buying gifts from him. Just tough.
That's heartbreaking. Ricky M's story involves something even more frightening right after deportation.
Yeah, Ricky was deported for life at 20. He'd lost his DACA status, the temporary protection, because of a drug charge when he was depressed.
And what happened when he got to Mexico?
It's terrifying. The source details he was immediately kidnapped by a cartel. They extorted money from his mom. Then they forced him to try and re-enter the U.S. before Border Patrol actually rescued him. He described Mexico, a country he didn't know, as feeling like another planet.
Kidnapped right after deportation. Wow. What about Alfonso B? His deportation came after a domestic issue.
Alfonso was deported after a short jail sentence for a domestic violence misdemeanor. It was after an argument with his U.S. citizen wife about his long work hours. She apparently defended him, said he didn't hit her.
And the source mentioned he was close to getting his status sorted out.
Yeah, reportedly close to getting his green card through his marriage. His whole family, his wife, her daughter, who saw him as a dad, their shared child, they all had to move to Mexico to be with him. They even went through Hurricane Harvey separated because of it.
Manuel G. from Des Moines. He was deported despite having an asylum case pending.
Right. And he'd finished a probation program for an old DUI. Really tough detail there is his deportation order came because he missed a court date.
Why did he miss it?
The notice might have never reached him. So the order was issued in absentia without him even being there. The source mentions his young U.S. daughter saving candy for when he came back. Just crushing.
Oh, man. And Brilio Q deported multiple times.
5 times. He'd spent most of his life here since he was 21. Worked with horses, owned property, raised U.S. citizen sons.
And the deportations stemmed from?
Relatively minor things over the years. A DWI, driving without a license, an argument. But these led to illegal reentry charges, prison time each time he came back. His son, though, the source notes, was still making the difficult trip to visit him weekly. Shows that strong family tie despite everything.
Looking at these stories and the analysis in the Human Rights Watch and community psychology sources, what patterns emerge about the human cost?
Well, the sources really underscore that deportations often hit people with incredibly deep roots here. Longtime residents, people with U.S. citizen kids or spouses, jobs, homes.
And often triggered by minor stuff.
Yeah, sometimes minor or very old offenses seem to lead to this life-altering consequence. And the impact radiates outwards: family separation, serious financial hardship. Plus, as the psychology source points out, families often lack access to support like culturally sensitive mental health care because of things like lack of insurance or just deep mistrust of the system after what happened.
Okay. We've covered a lot. This old law being revived, the court fights, the huge proposed funding bill, and these really personal, often devastating stories.
Yeah, putting it all together, the sources clearly show a major current focus on ramping up enforcement. You see different views on whether this is vital for security or if it's an overreach causing immense human suffering.
And the scale is just huge, isn't it? Millions of foreign-born residents, a large undocumented population, not just border crossers, but visa overstays too, and millions waiting in immigration court backlogs.
Right. And the sources also hinted how fragmented it all is. Big differences between states and cities, some welcoming, others like Texas, trying state-level enforcement like SB 4. Plus, that whole debate about local police cooperating with federal immigration agents.
So we've done this deep dive into the Alien Enemies Act, its modern use, the massive One Big Beautiful Bill Act proposal, the legal fights, and the very real human stories behind the policies. It's definitely not just about laws and budgets. These are sweeping policies with really profound effects.
Absolutely. And understanding all these pieces from the sources, the government rationale, the funding details, the legal arguments, the personal impacts, it gives you a much richer, though maybe more complicated picture.
So thinking about this whole landscape we've explored, the security arguments, the sheer scale of proposed enforcement, the legal questions about authority and fairness, and those deeply personal stories of family separation and hardship. What questions does that leave you with about how we strike that balance? The balance between national security, our legal ideals, and the undeniable human consequences.
It's a lot to think about. This deep dive definitely gives you plenty to chew on as you continue to follow this critical and constantly changing issue.